Yeah, ready when you are.
Right. Well, first thing is that anybody who sits at the back has to ask the first question. So whether you want to move.
If you can wait till the end, that'd be appreciated.
Right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our lecture this evening. My name's Dr. Hugh Jones. I'm Chief Executive of Sport Wales, the body that's responsible for the development of sport in Wales. And we have two roles. One is to get more people involved in sport, and the second is to develop high performance and excellence in Welsh sport. Good news is we've now got more children participating than ever before, and at the Olympics and the Paralympics we had our best successes ever, particularly at the Olympics. We had best success in 100 years. So things in Welsh sport, on the face of it, are actually going quite well. But we have a vision, and one of our visions for sport in Wales is that we want every child hooked on sport. And when I say every child hooked on sport, I mean every child. I don't mean we have a target of 70% of children hooked on sport, and that's fine. Because we know that if we did get 70% of children hooked on sport, we know who the other 30% would be. They would be children from deprived backgrounds, they would be children from BME backgrounds. They would be primarily girls. So that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable that sport is the preserve of white people or middle class people or any other particular group. It should be for everybody, and certainly that's what we're trying to do in terms of Sport Wales. So I'm absolutely delighted this evening to welcome Dr. Daniel Burdsey, who's going to talk to us tonight about British Muslims and the elite sporting landscapes, from participation to politics. Daniel has worked an awful lot in this area. He's principal lecturer in the School of Sport and Service Management at the University of Brighton. His research focus is on race, ethnicity, sport and popular culture, primarily in relation to British Asian communities. He's the author of British Asians and Football, Culture, Identity, Exclusion, and also the editor of Race, Ethnicity and Football, Persisting Debates and Emerging Issues. He is currently co-editing a special issue of South Asian popular culture on sport in the South Asian diaspora. So we're delighted to have Daniel with us today. He's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and if you could turn off your mobiles, then that would be particularly helpful, because I think we all want to concentrate on what Daniel's got to tell us this evening. And then obviously at the end there'll be 10 minutes, quarter of an hour for questions, and obviously the people in the back are going to start first with those questions. So we're delighted to have you here, and we're looking forward to what you've got to say to us. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, Hugh, for such a kind introduction. Thank you, Sophie, for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be talking to you guys and to come and visit you in this really prestigious centre. So thanks for coming. Thank you, Mark, for being in charge of PowerPoint slides. Hopefully I won't forget where I am. Okay, if we could move on, Mark, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about British Muslims and elite sport and participation to politics. I had in my mind that this would be quite clear and be quite straightforward, but when you have a long train journey, you meddle. So you have nice printed things covered in scribbles. I'm going to try and navigate my way around the scribbles as we go forwards. Okay, first thing I want to do is to talk about the title. Now, British Muslims and elite sport, from participation to politics. Now, one of the reasons I put on participation to politics was because I think two-part titles sound a bit flashier than sort of one-part titles. So it's nice to have a suffix, I guess. But more seriously, I guess it covers the two issues I want to talk about in my presentation today. Now, in talking about participation and politics, I'm not setting them up as a binary. I'm not suggesting that it's an either-or, there's participation and there's politics. I'm not suggesting there's been a linear movement from one to the other. And I'm not suggesting that participation and politics are mutually exclusive or separate. As a sports scholar, one of the main things I try to do with my students is to get across that sport is always inherently political. So politics and participation are linked. But I wanted to put in participation and politics and participation to try and show the various ways that British Muslims engage with sport at elite level, and to try and provide a more detailed, more complicated, and perhaps more positive articulation than is often done within the dominant discourse. So, the participation, and what I'm going to do today is just cover two case studies of work I've done, and I can provide references for these for anyone who's interested afterwards. The participation relates to the work I did on British Muslim male first-class cricketers, and the politics relates to the work I did on the British Pakistani Muslim boxer Amir Khan. I'm not going to try and cover everything. It's going to be a brief and selective overview in the time I have. It's brief and selective because of time, and it's brief and selective, I think, because of my expertise. I think I'm probably safer talking about what I know than what I don't know. So I'm sort of going for the less is more approach, or so I hope. But what I'm trying to do, the sort of theme throughout this, I want to try and show both the ordinary and the extraordinary aspects of British Muslim participation in elite sport. Again, not to set those up as a binary, but to suggest that these two issues exist. And I want to show the multiple meanings attached to participation, and I want to understand politics with a big P in terms of governmental politics, but also with a small p in relation to the cultural politics of sport and sport's inexorable political nature. And it is very much an emerging story. It's emerging in terms of the work I'm doing, and it's emerging in terms of what's happening in the broader British Muslim sporting landscape. Okay, so where do I come at this talk and these issues from? In the 9 years since I achieved my PhD, I guess I regard myself as a sociologist of race and ethnicity. That's my sort of broad self-descriptor, I guess. Within that, my interest is in sport, particularly in sport, and if we drill down even further, I'm interested in community, I'm interested in exclusions, I'm interested in issues of power and issues of identity, and usually if I can tie those all into the same research project, then I'm quite happy. Now, I covered it from my work, which is fundamentally, I'm interested in popular culture and sport and the experiences of young British Asian men. So to give you a little bit of background, I did my PhD between 2000 and 2004, and that was on two key issues really. It was the significance of football in the lives of young British Asian men, but alongside that, their exclusion from many of the manifestations of elite professional football. And the timing of that, between 2000 and 2004, meant that issues around Islam and Muslims became central, well maybe not central, but certainly a significant part to my research project. I came to publish my first book based on the PhD, British Asians and Football, and I want to flag up part of the subtitle. I wanted to call it Culture, Identity and Exclusion. I didn't want to use the term underrepresentation to talk about the very few British Asians playing professional football. I wanted to talk about exclusion, because that's how I theorise what's happening in professional football. I wanted to challenge the dominant discourse that this underrepresentation is about communities and their failure to engage. So I wanted exclusion to be that central sort of theoretical concept. Now, some short caveats to what I'm going to talk about today, based on what I've just said about my background. I am going to talk about Muslims from a South Asian background. Okay, I'm acknowledging the varied engagements of Muslims from other backgrounds in British sport. I'm also talking about male sports, and I think it's important to flag that up because I guess I'm reproducing some of those exclusions around gender and sport by only focusing on male sport. But I'm doing that because I'm concentrating on two of my own particular research projects. But I do want to mention briefly the work of some friends of mine, Aisha Ahmed, Samaya Farouk and Arti Ratna, who are all fantastic young British Asian academics doing some great work on Muslim women in sport, so please do check that out. And I'm looking at elite sport. Again, I'm not discounting or privileging or prioritising, I hope, elite sport, but I am, as I say, just talking about two projects I've done in recent years. And I also want to acknowledge the multiple and intersectional nature of identity. The people I'm talking about, the people I've interviewed, the people I've worked with in these projects identify as Muslims at various times, but I don't want to prescribe that Islam or being a Muslim is necessarily the most important aspect of identities at all times. Okay, I want to understand that different aspects of identities all play into the equation, and I think there's a fair claim levelled at some academics who can try and privilege or prioritise Islam for the sake of their work when it isn't necessarily reflective of the individual's self-identifications. Okay, so I think we're okay to move on. When I was thinking about how I could just introduce these issues today, I remember this quote from H.A. Hellier. When people in the West said Islam, they did not mean their neighbours, they meant the outer frontier. Not a comment about sport, but I thought it was useful in trying to get across the way in which the relationship between sport and Islam has been imagined historically in the UK. So I racked my brains of what I could think of the way in which Islam has been imagined. In the popular imagination, the relationship between Islam and sport has traditionally been seen as quite problematic. And within the dominant discourse, the problem has been attributed to Muslim communities themselves. There's been little recognition that the problem in many ways emanates from the structures and cultures of sport itself. I think in many ways that the relationship between sport and Islam in the UK is it's a long, but it's a hidden history. I found some details that the Punjab-born Asad ul-Haq, a Muslim cricketer, played for Middlesex and the MCC back in 1902. But it's very much, I think, a hidden history, excluded within the dominant narrative. Now, the way in which sport in the UK has imagined the Islamic other, if you like, hasn't usually been through a lens of religion. It's often been sort of juxtaposed as a lens of culture, usually Pakistani culture, and often manifested itself through cricket. So just a few examples. On the far left, the infamous on-pitch confrontation between the England cricket captain Mike Gatting and the Pakistani umpire Shakil Rana in 1987. The famous English cricketer Ian Botham spoke about Pakistan as a sort of place you'd want to send your mother-in-law for a long holiday. Lots of stories of English cricketers complaining about the food on tour in Pakistan, the lack of alcohol, and then famous sort of allegations around cheating and ball tampering, Wasim Akram and Waki Yunus back in the early 90s, and subsequent allegations, all perpetuated through a sort of neo-colonial Orientalist lens. Interestingly, I think British football, which we tend to associate even more with sort of racialised exclusion and discrimination, has rarely had, at least at an international level, a significant Islamic other to engage with. Certainly when England, for example, have played Senegal or Malaysia or Turkey, fairly crude ethno-national or racial stereotypes have tended to trump references to religion. But in many ways, I guess the main way in which people in the UK engage with ideas around British Muslims and physical activity, and the main ways in which most British Muslims engage themselves in physical activity is around physical education and the school curriculum. And there's a pervasive view in the popular imagination, very much in the education system, and also perpetuated to some extent in academia, about the seemingly inhibiting effects of Islam on sport and physical activity. Various things are rolled out around physicality, diet, religious obligations, Ramadan, issues around changing, showering, parental control. Others arguing that there's something intrinsic to Islam which prevents engagement in sport. And these are dominant discourses, and as we know about dominant discourses, they're hard to shift because they're reproduced and they become hegemonic. But I want this talk, if it does something, to be a corrective to the dominant discourse. I want to try and think differently and to try and rally against these pervasive discourses which serve to reproduce the exclusions they talk about. So things are changing. I think for my records, there are 6 British Muslim Olympians. Unfortunately, no women in Team GB, although we did have Dame Zaha Hadid, who designed the aquatic centre in London. So I think things are changing, and we're moving to greater engagement of British Muslims in the elite sporting landscape. And as I'll say at the very end, that presents a number of challenges which British sport institutions need to respond to. Okay. So the first of the 2 case studies I want to talk about today. This is the participation one, the cricket project. And this is a project I did, must have been about 3 or 4 years ago, funded by the British Academy, to look at the lives of first-class, elite, British Asian male cricket players. I wasn't interested in their playing, how many runs they've scored, or etc., etc. I wanted to know how they articulated their identities as elite British Asian cricketers. And within that segment, it became clear to me that there had to be a fairly strong focus on Muslim players, because in 2009, which must have been the end when I did the research, I estimated there are 30 Muslims playing first-class cricket in the UK, or in England and Wales. Roughly a third of those were players who were contracted as overseas players, usually from Pakistan, but some from India and Bangladesh, and 2/3 were British citizens. So this is the interesting thing I think about cricket, that alongside the exclusions in so many other sports, British Asians and British Muslims specifically are overrepresented at the highest levels of cricket. But let's put another caveat in that. This is as playing. Okay, minority ethnic groups are excluded and underrepresented in positions of power across all sports, as team owners, as coaches, as managers, etc. Now, my interest in looking at the experiences of Muslim players within this project, I wanted to see if the sort of post-July the 7th, 2005 climate had a big or some effect on the playing experiences of these players. Because remember, as I said, I'm interested in exclusions and discrimination. But as I went forward in the project, I found that the stories I was being told were much more straightforward. People's lives were much more ordinary than perhaps I was expecting. And by saying that, I'm not trying to argue that they're not worthy of interest, but I wanted to move away from the potential for a sensationalist portrayal of the lives of British Muslim cricketers, and just to show that these were regular sports participants who happened to be Muslims. So what I did was, within the broader project, I interviewed 9 British Muslim first-class cricketers and 6 British Muslims coaching at the elite level. And it was key to me because I wanted to get the voices of these individuals. It's the work I do, my methodology is underpinned by a critical race theory approach and the importance of trying to centre the voices of marginalised communities. I found diversity and I found similarity. Certainly there was a variation in forms and degree of religious adherence. There are a number of similarities, abstinence from alcohol and the choice of westernised dress, but lots of differences. Some players adhered to the schedule of prayer and were regular mosque attendees, others didn't go at all. Some of the players have beards, some are clean shaven. In addition, all but one of the British Muslims playing at elite level when I was doing the research were of Pakistani background, and the vast majority were born in the UK. There was only one Bangladeshi player, or British Bangladeshi player playing at the time. But I want to talk against any notion that there's a single or homogenous experience amongst these players. It differs in huge amounts of ways related to the various intersectionalities of their identity. And these players, like others, have argued more broadly in scholarly works around Muslims in Britain. In many ways, they're invisible. Their voices aren't heard. They're the people who are talked about in sport. Very little attempt to acknowledge at times their presence and to value them. But on the other hand, many of these players are hyper-visible because of various corporeal and material markers and particular political focus around young Muslim men in the UK. So, when I was thinking this through, I was mindful of the work of 2 scholars in particular, and I guess many people here will be familiar with the work of Verinder Kaura and Peter Hopkins, to try and think about how we might understand Muslim masculinities. And in these similar quotations, one that Verinder Kaura, I guess, is more generic, talks about the ways in which South Asian and specifically Muslim identities tend to be dichotomised, set up into this binary. Kaura talking about the dichotomy between the rioting, deprived, undereducated Muslim males on one hand, and the partying, secular Indian/Asian youth on the other. Peter Hopkins, speaking more specifically about Muslim men rather than South Asian men as a whole, talks about the 2 main discourses. And he mentions here that they operate both in dominant and at times, in academic discourses. One, emphasising patriarchy and aggression, and the other, effeminacy and academicism. So, I was thinking of M.Y. Lamb's work, Made in Bradford, talking about the need to, or trying to overcome the absence of the normal, everyday voices of those who are usually talked about. Now, I acknowledge that talking about elite sportsmen, I'm really not talking about ordinary people. These are people who undergo superhuman physical regimes and have superhuman physical talent. But I do want to shed some light, or in the project I wanted to shed some light on people who don't often get their voices heard. They're simply talked about. Okay. So these are some of the quotations which I received from players. I'll just give you a minute or so to read through them. They're all from separate players. And to make it clear, I mean, I anonymise all these individuals in the publications. All the individuals are anonymised because, as I've argued in my work, there can be quite significant repercussions for sports people who don't toe the dominant discourse. People who speak out too much, who talk about discrimination in the game, can be often identified as sort of risky bodies, people who maybe aren't welcome. So people are anonymised for that, and obviously other ethical reasons. I mean, certainly for me, having spent the majority of my academic career up to this point researching footballers, I was quite pleasantly surprised by the erudition and thoughtfulness which I think are present in these quotations, and very much a centralising of Islam in these players' lives to the extent that their cricketing participation was seen as somewhat peripheral. And many of these people were individuals who have played for England. They played international cricket, so these weren't necessarily people who were just flirting around the edges of a team. These were quite well-known individuals, some of them. When I come to talk about Amir Khan, hopefully it will become apparent that I'm quite sceptical about notions of role models, and I think notions of role models need to be seen in particular political and social contexts. But there was certainly, this was a recurrent theme that the players I spoke to picked out various individuals who they believed were, for want of a better word, significant role models for them, and provided significant cultural capital for being a Muslim cricketer in the English game. So, reference to the Pakistani cricketers, Saklan Mushtaq and Mushtaq Ahmed, the latter of those, up until, it may still be, I'm not sure, but was playing my local county Sussex, and also coaching the England spin bowlers, very, very famous Pakistani spin bowler. Spoke about the influence that these individuals had in the wider culture of English cricket. And I don't want to presume knowledge, but often cricket is seen as the quintessential English white middle class game, very much associated with cucumber sandwiches and cups of tea. And many of the institutions of cricket have been quite exclusionary around ethnic and racial lines historically. So this individual spoke about the significance. And within that, particularly the fact of these individuals wearing beards. So I'll just give you a second to look through. So the symbolism of what these individuals looked like, what they stood for, the way they were able to carve out a subcultural space for themselves within the sport. And the second quotation, again with reference to Saklan Mushtaq, reference to Muhammad Yusuf, who was an Islamic convert, formerly Yusuf Yahana, Pakistani international, and Hashim Amla, who people may be familiar with, current cricketer, South African Muslim cricketer, very successful player, has played in the UK, and is relatively well known because he was able to get his National Cricket Association, the South African Cricket Board, to give him playing shirts which didn't have Castle Lager, the team sponsorship, on them. So he's quite a well-known player. So there's an influence of these individuals. But alongside that, nearly every player I spoke to spoke about forms of discrimination. Apologies, it's quite a long quote, but difficult to digest. But this player spoke about his understandable irritation that going to playing cricket grounds, often the crowds aren't very big, players go to the boundary to field, and people often said that a recurrent sort of thing was that fans would say to Muslim players with beards, your head's on upside down. They said that was quite a big thing. The beard was a significant source of abuse. This is another player who spoke about going to Australia between university and playing cricket, and he spoke about his coffin. And I'm not a cricketer, I don't care less for cricket really, but I realised that I asked him what a coffin was, and a coffin is a huge case to put all your bats and pads and gear in. And it was sponsored by Hammam's cricket suppliers, and this guy said, are you part of Hamas? So these are the sort of things which players spoke regularly about experiencing. And just on the next slide, we'll just sum up the findings of that project. I'll come to talk about that. If I'm going to sum this up, and I'm not going to do this justice, I'm sure, players articulated the significance, yet at many other times the ordinariness of Islam. They often spoke about quite a generic, positive, but usually individualised sense of the role of Islam in their lives. They very rarely, if at all, spoke about specific connections between sport and Quranic verses or hadith, which talk about the role of sport being played in early Muslim civilizations, or the historically positive attitude towards recreational and physical activity in Islam. They didn't talk about sport having a role in keeping up with Islamic obligations around a strong, healthy body and mind, dietary discipline, or the dispersal of negative energies and feelings. And there was also, this might be unsurprising considering these people are making a career of it, there was no reflection on the views of some Islamic jurists that playing sport professionally was a distraction from some more dutiful obligations. So I think what was happening here was that these players, in many ways, represented a sort of middle ground. All the players spoke about the significance and prominence of Islam and being a Muslim in their cricketing lives, but in a very, very individualistic way, in a quite a generic way, rather than in conjunction with specific Islamic ideas and scriptures. So sport was in many ways a context. The faith was understood in this personal, individualistic way. Players also spoke about supportive structures, often said that, it surprised me, they said that coaches regularly gave them time and space to pray. They said that at many grounds and clubs, supportive dietary practices were put in place. But they also spoke about the marginalising subcultural effects of professional cricket, the role of alcohol, and some of the sort of hyper-masculine behaviours which reinforced a particular sort of white, macho sense of male identity. And as I alluded to earlier, I spoke about the presence of Islamophobic microaggressions. And microaggressions is a term which is often used in sociology to refer to not necessarily the overt forms of abuse or discrimination, but almost like a dripping tap of small things just getting at people over time. Players saying they're standing at bat in a match, difficult time, a player walks past them and says, "Why do you still live at home with your parents?" And keeping asking these questions, or "Why do you wear shorts in the shower?" And finally, players had this strong, they perceived role. They had the opportunity, if not maybe the power, to try and change some dominant ideas around Muslims and Islam in contemporary sport and society. Okay, just move through this a bit quicker maybe. The politics, the Amir Khan project. In 2004, in the Athens Summer Olympics, in this hitherto unknown young British Pakistani Muslim boxer called Amir Khan undertakes what I guess is a tale than expected, goes on to win the silver medal in the lightweight boxing category in the games. And this sort of comment from Zabir Khan, from the Medina Mosque in Bolton. Bolton is where Amir Khan comes from. It's quite indicative of the responses which were articulated straight afterwards. This idea that Khan was had become a hero type of character to the young Indian and Pakistani boys in Bolton. So these sort of newspaper articles were quite commonplace. And there was a suggestion amongst many in the media, politicians as well, that Khan was not just a role model or a hero for young British Asian or British Muslim youth, but that he had the capacity to try and unite different communities. So what I was interested in studying Khan, and as I was saying to Sophie beforehand, I have to give credit to my brother for me doing this, because he said, "Dan, you've got to write about this. You know, you're interested in sport and British Asians, you've got to write about this." And he also gave me the fantastic title for the article, if anyone's seen it, so I can't take that credit. So I was interested in what was being said about Khan, not about his boxing, about his perceived wider role, and what was the social significance. I was interested in how representations of Khan, primarily in the popular media and in politics, were reflecting dominant political discourses around multiculturalism, citizenship, and community cohesion. And the two themes I looked at in the article I wrote were the way in which Khan was seen to reflect and represent a normative model of British national identity, the whole sort of shared values agenda, which was being purported by people like Dennis McShane, Anne Cryer, David Blunkett, Gordon Brown at that time. And the way in which, by positioning Kahn as a role model, he was used to reconstruct pathological representations of other young British Muslim men. Because my argument is what was being said about Kahn implicitly was saying something about other young British Muslim men as well. And that's what I try and do in my scholarship. I'm a scholar of sport, and I try to show that sport has to be read in the wider social context. So these are some of the things which were being said around Kahn at the time. And I've italicised some of these. They're my italics, certainly, in the first quote. So the boxing development manager from Liverpool, you could see somebody who was from a different religion and a different area of the country. Well, Bolton's only about 30 miles from Liverpool, but who really lived like the rest of us. Again, a sort of normative statement around the white mainstream, and spoke like the rest of us. Heaven forbid, he come from Bolton. And conducted himself in an exemplary way. So implicit in all of these are suggestions. I'm arguing that other British Muslims, young British Muslim men, particularly, were not living like us, were not behaving in an exemplary way. A Bolton resident who seemed to crop up in nearly every newspaper I found said, when you look at him on the television, you see Pakistan, but when he opens his mouth, you hear Bolton. And that's good enough for us. I can just picture the accent now. I won't try and do it. He's definitely ours. You know, as if he's a possession to be claimed and owned. Sue Mossop, like somewhat predictably in the Daily Telegraph, a refreshing joy about the British Pakistani, proud to wear the British vest. Again, implicitly, others perhaps don't want to identify. And his old headmaster, rightly proud to be Asian, but also clearly British in his sense of identity. And that could do nothing but good. The Sun, and this is a sort of, I can't remember now, I never read The Sun, apart from this day obviously. In its sort of editorial, and you can see the date, 18th of July, 05. The Sun today salutes boxer Amir Khan, not for his fantastic victory against David Bailey in his first professional fight on the Saturday, but because he has the guts to say he's a Muslim who is proud to be British. Again, implying that other Muslims would not say the British is because they don't have the guts. Okay. And this was the sort of tropes which were reeled out. Barry McGuigan, Northern Irish fighter who seemed to have done a lot for relations in the North and the Republic. You might be able to pick it up there. Here the Union flag at his first fight, and there was London and black ribbons on the... Amir I'll beat the bombers, his famous Khan's army, his friends and relatives, which had put together a Pakistani flag, 2 Union flags with no terrorism underneath, star and crescent. And all this, these articulations from the individual I cited earlier, fundamentally reflect what was said in the Cantor Report following the urban unrest in the north of England in 2001, and it's quite a prescriptive way of understanding British citizenship. That it's about understanding difference, you know, as Claire Alexander would say, same difference but safe difference. So difference is acceptable as long as it's marginalised behind a clear articulation of Britishness. So just to finish on Khan, my argument was, and well, still is, that Khan was championed as a role model for reasons much beyond his sporting abilities. I mean, I guess we know that. We know that sports people are often championed for reasons beyond that. But it was as much due to his political expedience at a particular time and context as his sporting achievements. He provided something which, he was a hook, if you like, a way of an individual on which a particular political discourse around community cohesion and the so-called diversity management and the sort of shared norms and values of the new Labour government could be hung. So Khan was fundamentally represented as the good Muslim against the idea of the bad Muslim, and the government, as we know, and the media didn't deal in in-betweens. It was either or. Because his difference is acceptable, he's different, but not too different. He can be marginalised by his Britishness. His identification with the so-called shared values and traditional symbols. His endorsement of dominant rhetoric around the so-called war on terror. And his position as a role model to which other young Muslim men should aspire to follow. It was very much a discourse of, if Amir can do it, so should you, and so can you. But there are changing times, and certainly since Khan's turned professional, and he started to be a little bit more political, the public, I think, has held him a bit more at arm's length. He's spoken about racism, he spoke about being chased out of a boxing arena in Liverpool when his younger brother, Haroon, who you may know fought for Pakistan in the 2010 Commonwealth Games, was fighting. He's become a slightly more risky body now, and in many ways he might be seen to have fulfilled his political role. It also shows the ephemeral nature of sporting celebrity. Okay, so to finish, this isn't a conclusion as such, it's concluding remarks, and I'm claiming that means something different. So what I've hoped I've managed to get across is that British Muslims possess various roles in and relationships to sport, from participants to fans. And if anything, I strongly hope this, participation is only going to increase, and representation is going to increase at the elite level. Sporting Muslims, particularly at elite level, are significant to wider debates, wider political debates, wider social and cultural debates. And we need to, if not centralise sport, remember that it has a significant place. I spoke about issues around hyper and invisibility, these various roles which are in some ways attributed to elite British Muslim sports people. An emphasis on difference and intersectionality. We know that Muslims are widely homogenised and essentialised in the popular imagination. The same goes in sport. It's a call for an understanding within the popular imagination and in scholarly studies of sport to understand difference and to also place an emphasis on intersectionality and to understand how religious identity can interact with gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity to influence experiences. And I'm making a call here to sport to try and implement, to put in place participation pathways to enable young Muslims, male and female, to be able to have the sporting opportunities of those of other backgrounds, from playground to podium, which I think is a sporting or UK sport phrase. I'm also calling for an acknowledgement of problems and exclusion. There needs to be a shift, and it is happening, but a faster and a more substantive shift from the dominant discourse which in many ways blames underrepresentation of British Muslims in elite sporting spaces on those communities themselves, and looks to challenge sport itself, structures, institutions for appropriate governance and structures. I'm calling for an acknowledgement of the different forms of consumption of professional sport. when I did a fairly recent project for the Premier League, the Football Premier League, about the experience of the British Asian football fans, there's some quite interesting things being done. For example, some clubs were offering replica shirts without the names of betting companies and gambling companies, along with some of the clubs who take alcoholic sponsorship of young people's sports shirts. Sorry. And when Hugh asked me just earlier what was my sort of take-home message, it's this final point: it's that sport matters. Now, sport matters in a number of ways. It matters to British Muslims, particularly with the younger segments, but it also matters to the study of British Muslims and Muslims in the UK. It matters because it's significant, because it's popular, because it's in the media, it's everywhere. But it also matters because sport is that embodiment of bodies and corporeality. Sport, we cannot get away with it. Sport is about what types of bodies fit in, it's about how we dress, it's about how we perform. So I guess that's my final point, is that if you didn't think that already, maybe now that sport does matter. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. I think there was a few words that came up in your presentation which sort of struck a chord with me. I'll quote a few of them: marginalisation, exclusion, conformity, hypervisibility. And all of these issues, I think when we look at them, could apply to all sorts of equality issues. You know, many of the things that I think you talked about today, you could have done exactly the same presentation in relation to homophobia, and it would have been very, very much the same, or even gender. And I think we do have real challenges and things, and it was really interesting, I thought, the way in which politics has jumped on the Amir Khan bandwagon, you know, the same as politics has jumped on, you know, the Gareth Thomas homosexuality bandwagon. You know, he's the only guy we can think of, so let's stick him out there. So he must be a good guy, so we'll have him there, you know. But I think the important point, I think for me, in terms of much of this, and the challenge for bodies like ours as an organisation, is that sport does matter, and particularly physical activity matters. Because whether you are gay, whether you are Muslim, whether you are male, whether you are female, doesn't make you immune to coronary heart disease, or type 2 diabetes, or cancers, or whatever. We all have a responsibility to look after ourselves, and we all have a responsibility to create structures which enable those things to happen within society. And I think those are some of the really big challenges that we actually face within the cultural context that you provided us. Questions for Daniel?
Thank you. The question I had was about, I guess, the latter part, the politics side, and Amir Khan. It might be too early to speak about this, but how do you feel Mo Farah and his representation and the things that were said about him kind of tie into Amir Khan, and whether there's been a change in the discourse, whether it's moved forward or it's roughly where it was a few years ago? Yeah,
great question. I was actually talking to Sophie beforehand about maybe developing some work around Farah. I think it's an interesting one with Farah. If I just move to the side slightly, what I don't think most football fans, generalisation there I know, but don't necessarily understand are the number of Muslims who are playing top level Premier League football. And these are not players from South Asian background, they're players from an Arab background, often a sub-Saharan African background. I don't think that people necessarily recognise that. And I think the same is with Farah. I haven't looked into it in huge amounts of details, but I plan to. But I haven't heard or seen much in the media which talks about him in relation to his religion. a colleague of mine pointed out, and he thinks it's significant, that he's always known as Mo. He's not Mohammed. I mean, I guess that's his personal choice, but I haven't seen him referred to as Mohammed in the press. I think with Farah, discourses around his refugee status and have been more significant. And also, I think there's an interesting situation of him as this sort of family man, with the role of his daughter coming onto the track in London after the on Super Saturday. So I think it's partly due to because a lack of sophistication or a lack of knowledge within the mainstream or the mass media. I don't think a significant number of people know that he's a Muslim athlete. And so other, I guess, more sort of racialised or citizenship discourses trump that, but it's certainly something I intend to look into. Thank you.
Do you think there's a question about national interest there, or nationalism of sports? Because Mo Farah is just, if he had run for Somalia, or represented Somalia instead of the UK, then maybe they wouldn't have he wouldn't have been taken up or championed in the same sense. Even though, and I mean, you can't, if you look at his brother representing Pakistan, and he's chosen to represent the UK, there must be some kind of, that's where the conflict is happening. Maybe with that, maybe there's a question of allegiance to the UK with sports.
Yeah, a great question. I mean, sport offers something which is not necessarily available in other sort of social spheres, and it can provide that sense of contingent inclusion. Now, that's been sort of challenged around the Olympics with this whole idea of the so-called plastic Brits. There's the female triple jumper whose name escapes me, but as I think Sudanese by birth, but has represented Cuba and now represents the UK. But you're right, sport does represent a contingent inclusion, and it is a contingent inclusion because it's an inclusion while we, the nation, are winning in many ways. And you can see that, I guess, most prominently with football and the position of black footballers who've, they're fine as long as they're scoring goals and helping England to win, but when they're not, that shield from racism just evanesces straight away. So I think you're dead right. I think there's something, again, if we just take this slightly sideways from the Islamic element, I mean, the discrimination against asylum seekers, refugees, people with irregular migration status is strong, as we know in the UK. But for Farah, at that time, his sportingness, but also his Britishness, like Khan, just provides this blanket, and it takes precedent. But when times are not so good, that sort of those barriers, they tend to break down. And
I think it'd be interesting that recently I was at a secondary school with quite a large population of Muslim students, and a lot of the young Somali males are now, a lot of them play football, and they're being encouraged and constantly bombarded with these images of Mo Farah running, and they're trying to encourage the boys to run. I don't know whether it's some form of tokenism or what, but it's all of a sudden geared PE teachers into thinking Somali males must be good at running because Mo is, and they're trying to channel them into running, and I've actually witnessed it.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, there's a strong racial stereotype about East African athletes and discourses of so-called natural ability.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Because I mean, there's an issue with Asian youth in football anyway, but where there's a potential for it's going to be a long time before we see any changes in football to Muslim youth. But even though you could have a generation of Somali youths that are playing football in the elite level are being pushed into running, because most started in football, didn't he? And then he
Yes, I believe so.
spelling,
Yeah.
So,
But I think it's a classic. It's like Khan. It's a look what you can do, or look what you should be doing.
yeah.
You know, this sort of neoliberal, you know, like the Bill Cosby syndrome in America. You know, if Bill can do it, so
Yeah.
can you.
And you see there the quote that you put up there. You know, the absences of the normal, everyday voices of those who are talked about. That applies, you know, in Muslim communities. It applies in terms of gender issues. You know, how many PE teachers ask girls, what do they want to do? What do they want to do to take part? You know, what is it that prevents them taking part? How do we actually involve people in the first place? We come up with stereotypical approaches. Girls will play netball or, you know, hockey or whatever, because that's what, you know, the PE teacher did before them. I think one of the interesting things, I think, in terms of racial prejudice and the concept of Britishness, will be the decision that Rory McIlroy makes in terms of the next Olympic Games. You know, there's discussion about, actually, will he play golf for Ireland or will he play golf for Britain? You know, that's going to be a massive issue for him. And, you know, North Belfast boy, you know, there will be, whatever he chooses, you know, there will be issues surrounding his choice. And he's even beginning to say, well, actually, maybe I better not go. And I won't have to make the choice.
And the same with Wayne McCulloch years back. You know, a strong Protestant guy from the Shankill estate, fighting for the Republic of Ireland, or with a tricolor.
Not sure if anyone else has any questions on Dominique, but
Good night.
yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I wanted to ask you, actually, taking back to your cricketing case in cricketing. And am I right in, you did 9, was it? You looked at 9 cricketers?
Broadly, there was, I think, 20-something cricketers, but 9 of them were Muslims, yeah.
Oh, okay, so I was just wondering if you had any idea about their educational background. Because obviously these are quite very high-performing, first-class, you know, cricketers.
Yes.
I was quite interested in that.
Yes. Across the board, I would say that the British Muslim cricketers came from a much less privileged background than the other British Asian cricketers. Now, if any people know about British Muslim cricketers, you'll know that about 3 or 4 are all part of the same family. So that sort of narrows it down
Yes, that's quite limiting.
a little bit. But others I spoke to, and it's difficult when you come to anonymising things. You never know how much detail to leave in, because people were saying, my dad worked for this company. And I thought, well, if people know this company, they'll know this company's based in this city. But the players I spoke to were, I would say, fairly deprived backgrounds.
Right. I'm just wondering if you had any opportunity of comparing that with the younger players coming up. So, for example, the ones playing, you know, at the ages of, who are probably at from university, undergraduate age now, between the ages of about 18 and 20. Because I know that the MCC now have got quite a professional system supporting younger students coming through, and as far as I know, they're actually supporting them through university. And Cardiff is, I think, one of the universities that they send some of their elite younger players to. And I was wondering if you had any sense of the comparison of the background and schooling coming through.
Yes, I mean, certainly.
I mean, the reason I ask this is because traditionally, I think in England and Wales, the cricketing excellence has been drawn out of a particular class and a particular schooling background. You know, whichever part of the country one came from. So Mike Atherton or something comes to mind out of the, but he, you know, out of the northwest. Or, so I was just wondering if that sort of thing is now being, in order to see more actually South Asian younger cricketers coming through, they are probably actually also going to come through the public school system as that proliferates more.
From what I understand, and from the research which others have done, the issue lies really down very much in the grassroots, where there is a real separation of cricketing cultures.
Yeah.
There's very much the exclusive village green, suburban country cricket, and then there's a quite sort of urban South Asian, and to a much less so now, African Caribbean cricket culture. So the way I understand it is that the majority of young British South Asian cricketers are coming through quite urbanised competitions and leagues, and people I spoke to who had sort of input to the amateur side said there's a sense of exclusion right down at the grassroots, which in many ways steers players away from the opportunities to come through some of the traditional club systems and in higher education.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
I mean, that's how I see it. I mean, people talk about cricket cultures being much more polarised than perhaps even football cultures in the UK.
Should we take one final question? Go on then.
Obviously I found it really interesting. Picking up on the point you made about cricketers and the way they kind of talk about religion in a very generic, general sense, so they didn't really pick up on anything specifically motivating them in sport. And I wonder when you think if there was like a theological articulation of a kind of muscular Islam, sort of similar to what was done 200 or so years ago with Christianity, one where, you know, masculinity, and not masculinity of course, but kind of physicality was encouraged and theologically linked. Do you think that would be a remedy, or do you think that would encourage more British Muslims engaging?
There was it historically in Iran though, wasn't there? Quite early on.
Emphasis on sport.
Yeah,
I mean,
sport.
or physical activity.
Yeah.
I think so. I would want to direct you to the work of Samaya Farouk, who has written around muscular Islam and the role of physical activity in.
It's like first century Islam, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
But Samaya is looking at it in the contemporary. She's done work on schools, Islamic schools in the West Midlands, and the development of a sort of in line with this sort of muscular Christianity of the sort of 19th century, this whole idea that the battles of Waterloo were won on the playing fields of Eton, this sort of vigour and courage of public schools is being sort of reproduced in a different way for this sort of healthy body, healthy mind in certain. But what her work looks at as well is that certain pursuits are seen as more conducive, but also more appropriate in the current political context, if you like. So yeah, I can pass on details if you want of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions and thanks for coming along.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you, as Daniel said, for coming along, but most of all, thanks very much to Daniel for a fascinating talk. Next week, I think you've got Professor Linda Woodhead talking about Islam in Britain today, findings from the National Religion and Society Research Programme. So there's another thing for you. So can we thank Daniel once again for coming here.